I first found out about the subject of this video when his beaming face caught my attention on the homepage of Wikipedia one day. The picture was attached to an article about a band called Five Go Down to the Sea, which were described as post-punk. So that got my attention, as well as the fact that I'd never heard of this band before. The band in the picture is Five Go Down to the Sea's singer, Finbarr Donnelly. Donnelly was born in Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland, and relocated to Cork in the Republic of Ireland when he was 12. However, after moving to Cork, he essentially spoke and acted like he'd lived there all of his life. Donnelly met local boy Ricky Dineen and the two became best friends. And Donnelly would open Dineen to a whole new world of cutting-edge underground bands, typically ones that he heard on John Peel's famous BBC radio show. With Dineen eventually starting to play guitar, the two teenagers formed their first band, rounded out by brothers Phil and Keith O'Connell on bass and drums respectively. Donnelly named the band Nun Attax, which might sound a bit violent at first, but was actually named after the word for a mountain that sticks through a glacier. Yeah. Nun Attax would frequently perform at the Arcadia Ballroom, aka Downtown Campus, one of the few venues in Cork that was welcoming towards bands that played punk and new wave. Even in his teenage years, Donnelly showed that he was destined to be a frontman, and Nun Attax certainly played their part in helping the punk scene in Cork thrive for a couple of years. Nun Attax's songs were probably the most classically pop and rock inclined songs that Donnelly ever contributed to, though with Dineen's spiky, often counterpoint guitar playing and the slightly chaotic O'Connell Brothers rhythm section, it certainly wasn't without some more challenging elements. An EP of live performances recorded at Downtown Campus called Caught at the Campus was released in 1981, featuring 3 songs from Nun Attax, as well as one each from fellow Cork bands Mean Features, Urban Blitz and Micro Disney. That same year, Nun Attax recorded 5 songs for Irish radio host Dave Fanning. Basically a localised version of the Peel sessions, I suppose. Despite supporting U2 at the campus on at least one occasion, Nun Attax ultimately didn't become the next U2, as Phil O'Connell quit the band a month after their Fanning session, and when the band reconvened, they changed their name to Five Go Down to the Sea. At first, instead of finding a new bassist, the band recruited a local cellist, as you do. I couldn't find out how to pronounce the cellist's name for the life of me, but yeah, this was her name, and in some ways it did play the same role that a bass guitar normally plays in a post-punk band, but it might also explain why some of Five Go Down to the Sea's earlier work sounds kind of folky to me. Donnelly and Dineen also brought in second guitarist Mick Stack, providing some more melodic playing on top of Dineen's usually unconventional parts. Five Go Down to the Sea's debut release was the 1983 4-song EP, Not a Fish. With Donnelly's rich and crooning voice and Dineen and Stack's more jangly guitars, it sounds more accessible than most of what Nun Attax recorded in some ways, but the whole thing does feel like it has this weird Captain Beefheart-esque undercurrent to it, and Donnelly was starting to holler and babble a little bit more than he was on the Nun Attax recordings. Not a Fish was one of the first indie releases originating from Cork to be almost brazenly Corkonian in nature, setting Five Go Down to the Sea apart from bands not just outside of Ireland, but even in Ireland itself. Perhaps this is why when the band were based in Ireland, their shows outside of Cork, according to Stack, amounted to 1 or 2 shows in Dublin and 1 in the town of Dundalk. However, before the band moved out of Ireland, the EP did catch the attention of their hero, John Peel.
And that brings us to Elephants for Fun and Profit. Now, this is by an Irish band from Cork called Five Go Down to the Sea.
At this time, Cork was in a pretty significant economic downturn, which unsurprisingly stifled the music scene there. In addition, the Arcadia Ballroom was long gone after a fire in 1981 that they couldn't afford to rebuild from. Five Go Down to the Sea relocated to England in mid-1983. They no longer had a cellist at this point, as she opted to remain in Ireland and play with the National Symphony Orchestra. So Donnelly, Ricky, Mick and Smelly started off in England, squatting in abandoned flats and working construction sites for an income. Though apparently Donnelly instead focused on being Thatcher's worst nightmare and scammed multiple welfare officers for money. Five Go Down to the Sea's first Fanning session in October 1983 suggested that their cellist was possibly the only thing keeping them somewhat grounded. Alongside a cover of These Boots Are Made for Walking, the session's original songs included a very reggae-sounding number, a 48-second song called While My Cigar Meryl Streeps, and a very jazzy-sounding song, If the Jazz Band was fronted by a blind drunk Irishman who sounds like he's on the verge of sobbing over nothing in particular. The zaniness and genre whiplash in that set of songs certainly carried over to the band's first EP recorded in England, 1984's The Glee Club. By this point, Donnelly had just given up on playing any sort of normal-sounding guitar lines and just started thrashing away randomly. Meanwhile, it seemed that moving to England only served to make Donnelly want to sound even more Irish, and on top of that, he was basically always singing like this. The title track features interpolations of both Chattanooga Choo Choo and Yesterday by the Beatles. Then Jumping Jolly evolves into a chicken fried square dancing country hoedown. Then the next track often is like a more ominous take on the Not a Fish sound. Boon for Travellers is a drunken waltz with Stack playing the trumpet for the first time on a whim. And What Happened Your Leg ends with Donnelly impersonating Formula One cars and acting out a scene where he's a milkman and stuff. Despite the band's almost antagonistic individualism, both in their music and outside of it, Five Go Down to the Sea did start generating buzz in the UK as well. In fact, the EP was produced by John Langford of the band Mekons, one of Donnelly's biggest musical influences. With the band's live shows, which included several as an opening act for the Mekons, becoming increasingly well received, the Glee Club actually did manage to reach the top 50 of the UK indie chart. Just. Much of the band's cult following came from the Midlands of England. They weren't catching on quite as much in London, but one of those London gigs went well enough to catch the eyes and ears of famed Creation Records head Alan McGee. The most notable band signed by Creation Records at the time, the Jesus and Mary Chain, had actually played a show supporting Five Go Down to the Sea in 1984, and Alan was very keen to have Donnelly & Co. release something on his label as well. According to Creation co-founder and in-house producer Joe Foster, it was Smelly O'Connell's drumming that attracted McGee to Five Go Down to the Sea the most. Unfortunately, by the time the band stepped into the studio with Foster, Smelly had gotten homesick and tired of the touring lifestyle and moved back to Ireland. For numerous months, the band had been performing live and even recorded another fanning session in October 1984 with the aid of a drum machine. They did, however, step into the Creation studio with a human drummer, who they initially tried to pass off as Smelly O'Connell. Unsurprisingly, Foster wasn't fooled. But they did continue with the recording sessions, and those sessions resulted in a 3-track EP with the amazing title of Singing in Braille. John Peel played the title track from this on his radio show as well.
And I've got a finished copy now of the new 12-inch from Five Go Down to the Sea, which is on Creation Records. This is the A-side, Singing in Braille.
Dritte sind nicht ganz Bache.
As that snippet of the song may have potentially suggested, this EP was Five Go Down to the Sea at their most caustic. Donnelly and Stack's guitars thrash harder than ever, Strip Matter replaces Smelly's drumming finesse with brute force, and Donnelly's typical vocal style was becoming a little bit more snarly. Whilst Donnelly and Donnelly certainly loved a good drink or 40, on Singing in Braille, they didn't sound pissed, they just sounded pissed off. This definitely tracks because Five Go Down to the Sea's popularity at this time was stagnating, only made worse by the band's reluctance to talk to interviewers or record labels. To make matters worse, they were getting swiftly overtaken by other downtown campus bands. Micro Disney had a #1 album on the UK indie chart, and Stump, a band fronted by Mick Lynch of Mean Features, was starting to draw bigger crowds at their shows than Donnelly & Co.'s performances. Perhaps most aggravating of all, some critics claim that Five Go Down to the Sea sounded derivative of Stump, even though Five Go Down to the Sea had been playing publicly 2 years before Stump played their first gig as a support act for Five. Another potential source of angst for Donnelly in particular was his sexuality. He'd opened up more about being a gay man after moving to London, having grown up in an overly religious family, and finding London to be a generally more welcoming place for gay people than Cork. The release of Singing in Braille didn't turn things around for the band, apparently only selling a couple of hundred copies, and critics were starting to more often draw parallels between Five Go Down to the Sea and Nick Cave's freaky early 80s band The Birthday Party. Whilst Donnelly was singing about nothing in particular instead of Nick Cave's various forms of debauchery, I gotta say the comparisons aren't all that inaccurate. Donnelly has since said that he's unhappy with the Singing in Braille EP, feeling that the band were trying to be something that they weren't. In December 1985, tensions boiled over after Stack had attempted to organise a gig for the band, but when Donnelly arrived he was too langers to perform, resulting in a pathetic fistfight between the members. Stack left for the United States a few days later, and Five Go Down to the Sea were no more. After Donnelly and Dineen tried gigging together in early 1986 with their drum machine, with basically no success, it took them 2 whole years to reconvene and form their third and final band. Reuniting with Street Matter and bringing in Dublin bassist Maurice Carter, they named this band Beethoven, which to Donnelly was short for Fuck Me, Fuck My Beethoven. The band met Carter through his friend Keith Cullen, who would become Beethoven's de facto manager and would sign the band to his newly founded label Satanta Records. That label's first ever release was the 1989 5-track Beethoven EP, Him Guli Guli Man Dem. The EP pretty much picks up where Singing in Braille left off, with maybe a little bit of the Glee Club's sense of humour creeping back in. John Langford also produced this EP, however, unlike on the Glee Club, he decided that the drums this time around should have an obnoxious fuck ton of reverb on them. I mean, it was the late 80s, but Jesus. Carter's bass playing is the only real melodic constant in these songs, with Dineen as allergic to playing regular guitar chords and in-tune notes as ever, and Donnelly also almost completely abandoning any sense of melody in favour of hooting, hollering, snarling and wailing. The EP notoriously features a Beatles cover, which NME magazine referred to as the kidnapping, tarring and feathering, mugging, shagging and destruction of Day Tripper.
It took me so long to find out, but I found out.
Day Tripper was actually the first of Donnelly's songs that I heard purely because of that description. I read it and I was like, I gotta know what this sounds like. But NME did actually like the Him Guli Guli Man Dem EP, so much so that they named it their single of the week. Melody Maker magazine didn't quite enjoy the EP as much, however, bringing out the birthday party comparison again, but also producing one of my favourite music review similes ever, describing Donnelly's vocals as a bunch of woes like brickies on a roller coaster. Tragically, Beethoven's first EP would also turn out to be their last. 2 weeks after that NME shout-out, Donnelly was with Dineen at Hyde Park in London when he went for an impromptu swim in a non-swimming area in the Serpentine Pond. When a lifeguard went over to him, he went to swim under the lifeguard's boat for a laugh, but he never came back up for air. His body was eventually recovered from the pond the next day. Finbarr Donnelly was 27 years old. Dineen maintains that Donnelly was both a keen swimmer and shouldn't have been too inebriated to swim properly that day, thinking that he most likely got tangled in the reeds at the bottom of the pond. So unlike some of the more well-known members of the infamous 27 Club, Donnelly's death was extremely unexpected. The news of his passing sent ripples through former bandmates and others in the industry that encountered him both in Ireland and England, with a benefit gig featuring the Mekons and Stump happening not too long after. Another tribute gig in the following months, organised in Cork by fellow column of Nun Attax, saw the Sir Henry's Bar at full capacity. Dineen headed back to Cork for Donnelly's funeral and never went back to England. Then, in his own words, he drank his way through the 90s. Thankfully, Dineen did survive that dark decade, and he eventually teamed up with another former member of Mean Features, Sean Heffernan, forming a duo called Big Boy Foolish. Dineen's also taken part in several tribute shows and reunion-type gigs over the years, and at least one of those gigs has involved Smelly O'Connell, who'd quit music entirely between his departure from Five Go Down to the Sea and that particular reunion gig, but he has played music again in the years since. In 2020, the city of Cork also commemorated Donnelly and the 40th anniversary of Court at the Campus with a large mural of Nun Attax on Cork's Grand Parade. As far as I can tell, Mick Stack gave up music entirely and still lives in the United States, but even he paid a visit to that mural. Those who witnessed Donnelly in his short lifetime remember him as an almost mythical figure, slightly intimidating in his physical stature and erratic behaviour on and off stage, but people that interacted more closely with him generally remember him as a surprisingly smart and sensitive man. But most of all, Donnelly is remembered for just being a brilliant performer. Unfortunately, beyond the bands that witnessed Donnelly and his respective bands during his lifetime, their influence only really extends as far as other bands that have formed in Cork in the following years. That's a big part of why I wanted to make this video. I'd actually been planning to make a video like this a year ago, but I just sort of lost interest in it, maybe in part because the audio documentary by Irish journalist Paul McDermott titled Get That Monster Off the Stage was already a pretty comprehensive account of Donnelly's history, and most of the info in this video is sourced from that documentary, as well as the write-up about it on medium.com, which adds further statements from people that knew him. The other thing is that apart from the the footage of Nun Attax miming two of their songs on Irish TV in the early 80s, no other video footage of Donnelly appears to exist online. So because I didn't want this video to be a massive slideshow, and because the Get That Monster Off the Stage documentary is pretty thorough as is, I've done my best to make this an abridged version of the Donnelly story. If you thought this video was intriguing, then go check out the full Paul McDermott documentary. Lastly, if you want to listen to the music that I talked about here, then Bandcamp and streaming services have the 2020 compilation Hiding from the Landlord, which compiles most of the music that Donnelly contributed to, though there's some old ones that were left off, including the title track of Singing in Braille, and the compilation is named after a Nun Attax lyric from a song that also isn't on the compilation.
Hiding from the landlord!
A couple of the Five Go Down to the Sea fanning session recordings appear to be completely lost to time, but the other notable Donnelly songs that were omitted from the compilation do appear to be available on YouTube at least. And on YouTube you can also find a recording of a full live Five Go Down to the Sea set. As far as I can tell, it's the only one that's available online, but it's a very interesting look into, well, how they sounded for one, as well as the bizarre Irish patter between songs, and it happened to be in the era when they were using a drum machine. I guess it's rather fitting for this one-of-a-kind band that their only full live set available online is from one of their most dysfunctional periods. So that was my window into a set of bands that weren't necessarily making music without audible influences, but I reckon they at least took some of those influences and turned them into something unlike anything else in that era. At the very least, I hope that this video can serve as a good commemoration of another talented musician whose life ended far too soon. May Big Man Donnelly continue to rest in peace. Bye for now.